Hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. Echo of Life. Let's start. I want to begin with something rarely spoken aloud. Sometimes people don't disappear because they've stopped caring. They disappear because staying began to feel heavier than leaving. At first, it doesn't look like a dramatic exit. They start responding more slowly. They cancel plans without rescheduling. They stop explaining where they've been. Then one day, they're just gone, no arguments, no long goodbye, no formal closure. From the outside, it can seem cold, confusing, even unkind. But from the inside, it often feels like a matter of survival. People who step away from everyone are frequently misunderstood as distant, arrogant, or emotionally shut off. But the truth is usually more human, more layered, and more tender than most realize. Walking away is rarely the first choice. It's often the last. Most of these individuals didn't wake up one morning and decide to erase everyone from their life. Instead, they endured quietly, politely, patiently. For a long time, they tolerated being misunderstood. They tolerated being overextended. They tolerated being the strong one, the listener, the emotional anchor for everyone else. And slowly, something inside began to wear thin. Psychologically, this pattern often stems from emotional exhaustion paired with a quiet fear of being burdensome. Many who withdraw learned early that their needs were inconvenient, overlooked, or minimized. So instead of asking for support, they adapted by becoming low maintenance. They became the person who says, "I'm fine," even when they're not. The person who doesn't complain. The person who carries their load alone. Over time, this creates a dangerous cycle. When you don't voice your limits, people assume you don't have any. And that's where the breaking point starts to form. One of the key drivers behind cutting ties is what might be called emotional saturation. It happens when someone has given too much for too long without feeling seen, met, or reciprocated. Imagine pouring water into a cup that's already cracked. No matter how much you pour, it never fills. Eventually, you stop. Not because you don't care, but because you're empty. These individuals often replay moments that might seem small to others but felt significant to them. Being talked over, being forgotten, being contacted only when someone needs something, being praised for their strength instead of being offered support. Strength, when never allowed to rest, can turn into isolation. It's also important to understand that people who step back often struggle with partial closeness. For them, relationships can feel all or nothing. They're either fully invested or they feel unsafe. There's rarely a middle ground. This often comes from past experiences where vulnerability was met with dismissal, not protection. Maybe they opened up once and were brushed aside. Maybe they relied on someone who wasn't there when it mattered. Maybe they learned that closeness often comes with pain. So in time, distance begins to feel safer than disappointment. There's also a quiet grief that lives inside people like this. Not just grief for others, but for the version of themselves that used to try harder. The version that believed communication could mend things. The version that waited for people to show up differently. At some point, they stop explaining, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've said it too many times already. And here's something not often acknowledged. Cutting people off doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it brings a silence so loud it echoes. Many expect relief after disconnecting. And sometimes, at first, they do feel lighter. There's less tension, less emotional labor, fewer expectations. But then loneliness can creep in, because the same walls that keep pain out also keep connection out. Psychologically, this creates an internal conflict. On one side, there's safety. On the other, there's longing. They want connection, but only the kind that doesn't cost them their well-being. That's why people who withdraw often wrestle with guilt. Not because they regret protecting themselves, but because they still care. They still remember birthdays. They still wonder how others are doing. They just don't know how to return without losing themselves again. Another key factor is identity fatigue. Many of these individuals were placed into roles early on. The responsible one, the mature one, the one who has it together. Over time, they stop feeling like a person and start feeling like a function. When your identity is built around being useful, walking away can feel like the only way to rediscover who you are without expectations attached. Silence becomes a form of self-definition. There's also a subtle perfectionism at play. People who withdraw often hold themselves to impossible emotional standards. They don't want to show up halfway. They don't want to be inconsistent. If they can't be fully present, they'd rather not be present at all. So instead of showing up messy, tired, or unsure, they disappear. Not because they think others don't deserve effort, but because they feel they must earn their place by being enough. This mindset is exhausting, and it often leads to a moment where disappearing feels easier than disappointing. From a neurological perspective, chronic emotional stress can push the brain into a protective state. The nervous system learns that connection equals overwhelm, so withdrawal becomes a form of regulation. This isn't weakness, it's adaptation. But adaptation without healing can lead to isolation. One of the tender truths about people who step back is that many of them still deeply value relationships. They just don't trust their ability to be in them without losing themselves. They're not emotionally numb, they're emotionally overloaded. They're not cold, they're tired. They're not heartless. They're guarding what's left of their heart. There's often a strong self-awareness in these individuals. They notice patterns, dynamics, and emotional imbalances long before others do. But awareness without boundaries turns into resentment.
I can't hold it back.
So instead of confronting,
it's all
negotiating, or asking for change, they choose the cleanest exit they know, silence. Because silence doesn't argue back. It doesn't misunderstand. It doesn't demand more. But silence also doesn't heal. The danger comes when cutting everyone off becomes an identity rather than a phase, when self-protection turns into avoidance, when solitude stops being restorative and starts feeling isolating. Some convince themselves they're better alone because they've never experienced safe connection. Others confuse independence with emotional exile. Deep down, many are still waiting, not for apologies or explanations, but for proof that connection doesn't always require self-erasure. The psychology of stepping away isn't about cruelty or indifference. It's about boundaries learned too late, needs ignored too long, and a strength that was never allowed to be soft. They didn't leave because they didn't care. They left because caring cost them too much. And in the quiet they create, they're often trying to answer one question they've avoided their whole life. How do I stay connected without disappearing inside myself? That question doesn't have an easy answer. But it's where healing begins. After the withdrawal, something unexpected happens. Life gets quieter, not just externally, but inside too. There are fewer messages, fewer interruptions, fewer emotional negotiations. For a while, that quiet feels like relief. Many describe this early phase as breathing room. Their nervous system finally slows down. The constant anticipation of being needed, misunderstood, or drained begins to fade. But then comes the second phase, the one seldom discussed. Because silence doesn't just remove noise, it removes mirrors. When you step away from everyone, you also step away from reflections of yourself. No one is there to remind you who you've been, who you're becoming, or how you affect others. For those already wrestling with identity fatigue, this can feel both freeing and disorienting. Psychologically, humans are relational beings. Our sense of self is shaped through connection. When connection disappears completely, the mind starts filling in the gaps on its own, often with assumptions, self-criticism, and unresolved memories. That's when the thoughts begin. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe I should have explained better. Maybe it really was all my fault. This inner dialogue can grow intense because people who withdraw tend to be highly reflective. They replay conversations. They analyze tone. They wonder how things could have gone differently. Here's the paradox. They left because explaining never seemed to work. And now they're explaining everything to themselves. Another shift happens emotionally. Without constant external demands, buried feelings start surfacing. Sadness that was postponed, anger that was suppressed, grief that was never processed. This is why some feel worse before they feel better after stepping back. Distance doesn't erase emotion. It amplifies what was ignored. And this is where many get stuck. Instead of using solitude as a place to heal, they use it as a place to hide. They convince themselves that being alone means being strong, that needing less means growing, that independence means disconnection. But emotional growth doesn't come from cutting ties. It comes from learning how to tie them without strangling yourself. One of the long-term effects of withdrawing is relational hypervigilance. After experiencing emotional overload, the mind becomes highly sensitive to potential threats. A delayed reply feels like rejection. A small misunderstanding feels like a warning. A simple request feels like pressure. So even when new connections appear, the person keeps emotional distance. They enjoy people but don't lean in. They listen but don't reveal. They stay present but not open. This creates relationships that look functional on the surface but feel hollow underneath. And then the person might say, "I just don't connect with people anymore." But the truth is more nuanced. They connect, they just don't feel safe enough to stay. Beneath the surface, there's often a deeper fear, the fear of repeating the same pattern. Many believe that if they let someone close, the cycle will restart. They'll give too much, overextend, lose themselves again. So instead of learning new boundaries, they choose permanent distance. This is understandable but not sustainable because humans don't heal in isolation forever. They heal in relationships that feel different from the ones that hurt them. Another consequence is emotional atrophy. When you stop practicing vulnerability, it becomes harder to access. Feelings get harder to name. Needs get harder to express.
I can't hold it back.
Even joy can feel muted because joy often needs to be shared to feel real. Over time, the person might start to feel emotionally flat. Not depressed, just disconnected. Life feels manageable but not meaningful. And that's when the quiet question emerges. Is this peace, or am I just numb? That question can be frightening because it challenges the identity built around self-protection. If cutting everyone off wasn't the solution, then what is? The answer isn't going back to how things were. And it isn't letting everyone back in. It's learning discernment. Healthy connection isn't about being accessible to everyone. It's about being selective. People who withdraw often never learned they were allowed to choose who gets access to them. They thought relationships were obligations, that loyalty meant endurance, that leaving was failure. So they swung to the opposite extreme. But healing lives in the middle. It lives in learning how to say no without disappearing, how to express needs without apologizing, how to stay without shrinking. This is uncomfortable work because it requires unlearning survival strategies that once worked. And yes, stepping back worked for a time. It protected energy. It restored control, created space, but it was never meant to be permanent. Another layer is grief for relationships that never became what they could have been. People who withdraw often grieve silently. They don't talk about it because they were the ones who left. But leaving doesn't erase loss. They grieve the friend who never showed up differently, the family member who never changed, the connection that almost worked. This grief is complicated. It mixes sadness with relief, love with disappointment, hope with finality. Unresolved grief has a way of leaking into future relationships. It creates emotional distance. It makes people cautious. It makes them hold back. That's why some seem present but unavailable, warm but unreachable, kind but guarded. They aren't uninterested. They're protecting something that was never protected before. One of the most important realizations for people in this pattern is this: cutting everyone off was not a character flaw. It was a response to unmet needs. But staying cut off doesn't meet those needs either. Connection doesn't have to hurt, but it does require skills many were never taught. Communicating boundaries early instead of late, noticing resentment before it hardens, allowing others to disappoint you without internalizing it, and, most importantly, letting yourself be imperfect in relationships. People who withdraw often believe they must show up fully or not at all. That belief keeps them isolated because real connection happens in partial presence, in showing up tired, in saying, "I don't have much to give today," in being human instead of always being reliable. Healing doesn't mean reopening every door. It means learning how to keep some doors open without standing in the doorway, bleeding. For those who have stepped away, the path forward often begins quietly, with one safe person, one honest conversation, one moment of choosing connection over withdrawal. Not because you're afraid to be alone, but because you're ready to be seen. The psychology of people who cut everyone off isn't about rejecting others. is about searching for a way to belong without self-sacrifice. And when that balance is finally learned, something powerful happens. They don't disappear anymore. They don't overgive anymore. They don't vanish to feel safe. They stay. Not everywhere. Not for everyone. But where it matters. And that's not weakness. That's emotional maturity. Thank you everyone. Watching my video. Please subscribe my channel. For more update.